genetics a little bit now. Okay, the rest of this stuff is all about genetics and DNA and that kind of thing. So we're going to look at first reproduction and variation. Okay, variation's important. We want, I mean, if there was no variation, every single one of us would all be exactly the same, which would be boring. Okay, variation's important because variation allows for adaptability. Okay, if we're all the same, one thing could come along and wipe us all out because we're all exactly the same, right? We don't want to have that. We want to have variation so that some things will survive a change in the environment. Okay, I'm not saying everything is going to survive, but variation makes it more likely that at least the species survives a change in the environment. Right? Variation is important. This is a big concern worldwide right now with crops. Okay, most of the food crops that we have been bred to have certain qualities. We want them to grow big, we want them to make lots of food, we want them to grow quickly, and we want them to be resistant to certain things like bugs and weeds and fungus and stuff like that. So they've been bred over the years, okay, and I say that you actually do breed plants, right? You pollinate them in a certain way so that plant A that has the qualities you want is pollinating plant B, which also has some qualities you want, and then baby plant AB has both. Follow me there? Okay. Now, a lot of people will term that a genetically modified organism, and it, to some extent, is. Okay, a GMO, you guys heard that term before? Okay. The concern with that is that we've put the qualities we want into crops so much that we've lost some things along the way. Okay, hasn't been a big deal because they're doing what we want. They're growing big, they're making lots of food, making it easy to feed everybody. The issue is that if something comes along, every single crop will be susceptible to it if it's something that we've bred out of that plant, right? Like the resistance to some pest or something like that. Okay, so that's the concern. That's the importance of variation. We want to have variation in a population of organisms to prevent the eradication of the whole thing by one change. All right. So first off, we need to distinguish between sexual and asexual reproduction. That's pretty easy. Okay, identify examples of each type. We're going to look at how variation is produced in each type. All right. Now, asexual reproduction just is splitting in half of something, right? Okay. If you just split in half, the two cells you produce are what? They're exactly the same. Okay. Now, if you survived long enough to reproduce, that may not be a bad thing because obviously your genes made you adaptable enough or fit enough for your environment that you were successful. Okay? But you don't want every member of the population to be exactly the same. Okay, and we're going to look at benefits and drawbacks of each type of reproduction in terms of adaptation to the environment and the production of variation. So we're going to look at a lot of different ways that organisms reproduce. Yes. Yep. Yeah. For a bacteria, that's usually when that happens. Some step in the copying of the DNA was messed up, and then yeah, one of the organisms is slightly different than the other. But it's rare because the machinery that does the copying is pretty good. But when you're a bacteria and you're dividing all the time, because bacteria do reproduce very quickly, okay, there's going to be mistakes made. You know, if you're talking about, you know, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32. Well, pretty soon you got lots and lots of them going on. Even if only 1 out of every 1,000 makes a mistake, well, it doesn't take long before the mistakes start adding up and you start getting variation. Okay. All right, so with asexual reproduction, okay, like begets like, and that applies to organisms that reproduce asexually. So a single individual is the sole parent, copies all their DNA, and produces genetically identical offspring. Okay, so we call that process, the splitting in half, we call that mitosis. Okay, mitosis means the splitting of the cell. Okay. Okay, so DNA is copied and allocated equally between the daughter cells, okay, and the offspring are exact copies. So in asexual reproduction, we've got our 2 chromosomes here. We've got a black one and a red one. Okay, chromosome replication is the first stage of asexual reproduction. That is the copying of the DNA. All right, so you can see now we've got 2 copies of the black one, 2 copies of the red one. Okay, prophase, metaphase, prometaphase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase are the stages of mitosis. You'll go into that in detail in Bio 20. Okay, so essentially we get the splitting of the two cells. Each cell got a black one and a red one. Okay, and now those cells completely separate. Okay, and we've got two cells that are now operating but are genetically identical. Okay, some multicellular organisms can reproduce by asexual reproduction. Okay, you can't. You're not going to split in half. Okay, and produce an exact copy of yourself, turn them into your slave, make them do all the dirty work. Okay, you're not going to do that. But some simpler multicellular organisms can, like a hydra. How many people have seen a hydra before? Okay, right. So a hydra is just, it's very small, lives in like pond water and things like that, and it can produce buds. Okay, and these buds will actually like fall off and get swept away in the current or whatever, and they'll attach to another rock or some piece of substrate on the bottom, and they'll grow. But again, they'll be genetically identical. Okay, so hydra, okay, which is a relative of the jellyfish, can do that. Okay, since the cells of the bud are produced by mitosis, they are genetically identical. Okay, very rarely genetic differences happen. Okay, those are mutations. Mutations are rare. Okay, and unfortunately, 99% of all mutations are bad. Okay, most of the time a mutation does not lead to a better organism. 99% of the time it actually is worse, and that organism usually dies. Right? Once in a while you get one that's better. Okay? That's how natural selection happens. Okay? If that organism is better, pretty soon all the organisms that will be in that population will be of the better variety. Okay. Some plants and animals can reproduce asexually as well. Potatoes undergo what we call vegetative propagation. Okay, so Mark Watney in The Martian, okay, used vegetative propagation to survive on Mars by growing potatoes. Okay, you see the little buds coming out of this potato. We've said several times already in class that if you split the potato in half and throw the halves in the ground, okay, as long as each half has an eye on it, that eye will grow and you'll get a potato plant. Okay? Now, again, that potato plant is genetically identical to the one that made the potato because that's where the cells came from, was that plant. Right? So you're not getting any variation in your genetic variation in your population by using vegetative propagation. All right? Now, with a food crop, again, that's a worry. If there's some sort of fungus out there or bug or something like that, okay, that can infect one of the plants, it can infect or bother all of them, right? And that's when you can have a crop failure, famine, okay, things like that. In Ireland, this was a big deal because they had the big potato famine back in the late 1700s, I think it was, okay, where they had some sort of fungal parasite that essentially killed all the potatoes, okay, and in Ireland, potatoes are a major staple, okay, of the diet. Without potatoes, a lot of people starved. Okay, so you want to have different varieties of potatoes. You don't just want to plant all the same potato. Okay, some of the red ones, some of the yellow ones, okay, small ones, purple ones, whatever. Okay, but always have lots of different kinds. Okay, starfish. Starfish is an example of an animal that can reproduce asexually. It doesn't do it on purpose. If it gets half eaten or torn apart, as long as a piece of the central ring remains, it'll grow a whole new starfish. Okay, so this was one arm right here. This was one arm of a starfish. Okay, and it got torn off of the starfish. But a little piece of the central ring. So on a starfish, I'm just going to challenge my artistic ability here. That's not bad. Okay, there's actually a central ring to a starfish. You see it better on the bottom than you do on the top. Okay, inside, as long as one part of this central ring remains on an arm that's been torn off, the whole starfish, the arm will grow a whole new starfish back. Okay, this is a big deal because a lot of fishermen, they hate getting starfish tangled in the nets because the starfish have a really rough skin and it catches on the nets and really causes a twisting and bunching up of the nets, so they get really ticked off when they end up in there because they don't catch as many fish. So they would take them out of the net, tear them apart, and throw them back in the water. not realizing that they were only multiplying their problem by doing so, because any part of that starfish that still had a piece of the central ring grew into a new troublesome starfish. Okay. By the way, you can't eat starfish. Has anyone ever held a starfish? Like, they're hard as a rock on the top. Okay. And if you ever turn them over, you see the little tube feet. They're called pedicellary, and they're really kind of cool. They're little tiny suction cup feet. That's how they move. Okay. It's how they eat. It's how they. It's really a very unique organism, but it's also kind of simple, no central brain or anything like that. Worms can do this, okay? An earthworm, if you cut an earthworm in half, okay, the two parts will grow back. In fact, you can chop one, and everything but the tip of the tail will grow into a new earthworm under the right conditions. Okay, so some animals are capable of regeneration like that. We're not, unfortunately, capable of that. The more complex you are, okay, the less likely you are to do that. Basically, once you have an endoskeleton, okay, skeleton made of bone like we have, regeneration basically becomes impossible. Okay, we're simply too complex for that to work. Okay. All right. The other problem with this, though, if it came from a piece of this starfish, every starfish that grows from that will be the same, genetically identical again. Okay, so there's not a lot of variation being produced here in this asexual reproduction that we're looking at. Have you ever seen a starfish open up an oyster or a clam? That's how they eat, hey? Okay, so they clamp down on either side of the clam, and because the clam can't breathe when its shell is closed, right? If you ever look at a clam, they have a little siphon that sticks out. It's got two holes in it. Water comes in one and out the other, and that's how they feed, and that's how they breathe. Their gills and everything are inside the shell. So starfish will clamp down on them, and then they'll close up to try and avoid the starfish. Well, the starfish is on the outside. It can breathe. It can do whatever, and it just keeps pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling, and eventually the clam gets tired, okay? And because its muscles have to work to hold the shell closed. And once that shell opens a little bit, inside this central ring is the stomach and the mouth. And when a starfish eats, it turns its stomach inside out, barfs it out of its mouth, whole stomach. Like, imagine taking your digestive system and taking it outside your body inside out. That's what it does. Okay, inside the clam. Okay, as soon as it gets that shell open, in goes the stomach, digests the clam, and then sucks it all back in. Yeah. Yeah, it's funky. There's some really strange animals out there. Okay. Yeah. Okay, other examples of asexual reproduction. This is an amoeba that's in the process of splitting in half. Okay, it's only still attached here at the end. Okay, you can see a nucleus here, and the other nucleus is right there. It's kind of hard to see, but okay, it's about to split in half there. Mold. Mold reproduces asexually, right? It produces spores that are genetically identical to the parent plant. Okay, and then that spore lands on something else and it'll grow. That's the problem with that toxic mold that can sometimes get in houses if they've been wet. Okay, it gets inside your sinus cavities and then it can actually develop in there because it's warm and moist and dark, just like mold likes it. Okay, bamboo. Bamboo will reproduce asexually. Okay, so if there's a chunk of it and it falls on the ground, it can actually grow from that chunk. This plant over here, okay, these two big ones in my classroom here, all of these used to be one stick, like this. Okay, but every time it gets too tall and it falls over, I cut it off and I stick it back in the ground. And I take the other pieces and I stick them in the ground, and they all grow. Okay, this one here finally died. Okay, that was the original, I think, actually. But you can see here that this part here is cut off on the top. That piece is down there. Okay, I just cut them off, stick them back in the ground, and it grows a whole new plant. And my mom gave me this plant. She has a plant that's even bigger than this. The problem is, my plant, that plant, her plant, whoever she got the plant from, they're all genetically identical because they're not reproducing per se. Okay, we're just taking pieces of them and sticking them in the ground. It's all the same cells, right? So it's all still the same genetic material. So if anything comes along, I'll lose both of those at the same time. Okay, if it's something they're genetically susceptible to. Okay, now that's asexual reproduction. There's not going to be a lot of variation produced in there except by random chance of mutation. Okay, now that said, paramecium have a way of producing some genetic variation. In the paramecium, there is a macronucleus, that's the big one, and a micronucleus. and paramecium will conjugate. They'll get together and they'll exchange the micronuclei. Okay, so they'll just trade them. And then that micronucleus, which contains some of the cell's DNA, goes back to the big nucleus, the macronucleus, and all that DNA gets written back in to the main DNA. And now that paramecium is genetically different than it was before. Now when it reproduces, there'll be two exact copies, but they'll be genetically different from what it was before the conjugation. So there's little ways here and there that organisms have developed to produce, okay, some variation. Bacteria will also conjugate and exchange DNA to produce variation before they divide. Okay, so there are ways around making exact copies, but for the most part, it's an exact copy. Okay, now, one of the main advantages of sexual reproduction is that it involves always the combining of separate organisms' DNA. Okay, right now in every one of your cells you have 46 chromosomes. You got 23 of them from mom and you got 23 of them from dad. Okay, and mom got 23 from grandma and 23 from grandpa, and same with dad. Okay, so you got to imagine that even if nothing else happens, you are a half and half combination of your parents' DNA. Okay, everybody follow me there? Okay, but remember, your mom has 46 chromosomes. She only gave you 23. So you could have got half of grandma's and half of grandpa's in there. Okay, so there's a lot of opportunity for variation just in that. But the really wild thing is that when gametes are being made, so when sperm and eggs are being developed, when the DNA is being split, sometimes the chromosomes catch on each other. So let's say when the egg that formed you was forming in mom, a chromosome from grandma and a chromosome from grandpa got stuck together. And the cell has to pull those apart and fix them before that egg can be properly formed. Well, sometimes when that happens, the tip of one of grandpa's chromosomes ends up on the tip of grandma's chromosome and vice versa. And now you've got a chromosome that's a little bit of grandma's and a little bit of grandpa's, and it's ending up in an egg that's somewhat going to be yours, and it's going to combine with DNA from dad, and holy smoke, can you get a ton of variation that way? Okay, we call it crossing over. Okay, it's just a natural thing that produces a lot of variation. So sometimes, you look at parents and the kids and you're like, wow, they look exactly the same. You can sure see where they got that from or whatever. But sometimes there isn't that. Okay, and the kids don't look much like either parent. Okay, like my first son, I mean, he's a spitting image of me. Okay, and my second son is a spitting image of my wife. Okay, and it's just sometimes it works out that way. Okay, but sometimes you also see, in families that have like 3, 4, 5 kids, like, wow, that one doesn't look like either of you. But it's so much a combination of both that you don't see it. Now, when you have kids, it's not so much just about the face. You'll see when you have kids, but you can look at like their hands, okay, their ears, their teeth, and you can always see this little bit of you or this little bit of your partner or whatever in the kid. It's really kind of a fun thing. Okay, but you can see all this kind of genetic stuff. Like I noticed when my son was about 2 years old, he had my feet. Right? This is, I don't know why you notice it then, but my three middle toes are all the same length. So, yeah, I don't know, I got really messed up feet. Okay, they're like all the same length, right? I got like the big toe, and then there's all three, and then there's like the baby toe, and yeah, it's messed up. But his feet he's got the 3 bunched together in a row too. Okay, it's just one of those weird genetic things. Like it's a recessive thing, but he's got it just like I do. Yeah, so you see kind of this idea here. Now, this picture here, okay, we got these 2 parents and these 2 parents. Can you pick out whose kids are whose? And it's not a boy and a girl from each one. I'll give you that hint. Can you tell whose are whose? It's tough though, right? It's not obvious. But if you look long enough, you start to see, okay, how this works here. Okay, I mean, I think this one's pretty clear, right? That he's from those 2. Okay, and that these 2. Is that what you were thinking? because I didn't know the book I scanned it from. Okay. It is 2 and 2, but it wasn't boy, girl, boy, girl. Yeah. Okay. Is there a lot of variation there, though? Right? I mean, when you look at the faces, you look at kind of the bone structure and things like that, certainly you can see some of that genetic kind of variation. Like for this guy here, it's the chin. He's got his mom's chin. Right? He's got a very pointed chin. Okay? Right? This guy here, it's the teeth and the smile. He's got his dad's smile. Right? Same kind of cheek structure. All right? And for these two, they've got mom's chin. Both of them have mom's chin. Okay. Just you got to look for like one thing or another, right? But there's still quite a bit of variation in there. They got a little bit of stuff from mom, a little bit of stuff from dad. Okay, like they both have these two. They both have dad's nose. If you look closely. When you have your own kids, you get better at looking for that kind of stuff. Okay, that's why I always find parent-teacher interview night to be like the most interesting night of the year. Okay, because then your parents come in and I'm like, oh yeah, I totally see it. Yeah. Okay. Sometimes it's good, sometimes bad. Okay. All right. So when we're making gametes, okay, there's mitosis that goes on, but there's also a process called meiosis. Meiosis is how gametes get produced. Your gametes can't have 46 chromosomes in them. They can only have 23. That way, when your gamete meets up with your partner's gamete, you get the total proper number 46. Okay, so you initially have a cell that copies all of its DNA, and then it divides. Okay, now you have 2 cells that are normal. Those cells divide to produce 4 cells. They don't copy. Okay, in this division here, there's no copying of DNA. So when those cells divide, you get this. You get gametes that have 1 copy instead of 2 of every chromosome that you have. Now, this would be the simplest production of gametes. You got 2 gametes that had all of dad's DNA, or had all of grandpa's DNA, and 2 gametes that had all of grandma's DNA. Okay, if that came from dad. And then same on this side, there was some switching. All right, so let's say that this was the egg produced, and this is going to be the sperm produced. Okay, when this cell copied and then divided, a cell from grandma or a chromosome from grandma and a chromosome from grandpa ended up in this cell. Same with this one. Now when these split, I'm going to have a gamete that's got a grandpa and a grandma, grandpa, grandma, grandma, grandpa, okay, and so on. So now that's going to produce some variation. Okay, everybody follow me there. Now that's if there's no breaking of the chromosomes and they have to go back together in that thing called crossing over. That produces even more. Okay, so there's a 50-50 chance that a gamete produced by an offspring will have a maternal chromosome or a paternal one. Okay, now crossing over. This is the process of crossing over. When the DNA is being copied, sometimes the chromosomes get tangled, okay, because they're not a solid structure like this. They're actually more like you had a frame shaped like an X and you wrapped thread around it. Okay, because the DNA would be the thread. As that wrapping, is it possible for the DNA to get tangled? Absolutely. And the DNA gets tangled with another chromosome. You have to pull them apart. You break the threads. You got to tie the ends together. Okay, and that sometimes means that you might get a little bit of one chromosome on the tip of another, okay, and that's going to produce even more variation in the next generation there, and that happens a lot, okay. Crossing over is very common, okay, happens in basically every time a gamete is made. There's a little bit of crossing over that goes on. Okay, so in the case of humans, the number of possible combinations of maternal chromosomes and paternal chromosomes is 223, or about 8 million different combinations possible. Okay, so there's a lot of variation possible, okay, through that type of reproduction. Well, if you had twins, if you have identical twins come from when that first cell gets fertilized and it splits in half, the cells get actually separated. They don't stick. That's going to produce identical twins. Fraternal twins is 2 separate eggs being fertilized, right? So yes, that is possible. There's still, I mean, you can always tell twins apart, right? I mean, you know each other. There's some small difference or whatever. There's always some little tiny thing. Okay, Caitlin knows, right? So yeah, I mean, there's going to be slight genetic differences, but when you get right down to it, looking at like DNA, if they do one of those like CSI DNA tests, the odds of you having the same DNA as somebody else are over 8 billion to 1. Yeah, well, I mean, population in the world is what, about 7 billion now? So basically, there's no chance that there's someone in the world who has exactly the same DNA as you. Okay? Is it possible someone is close? Not really. Okay? I mean, really, the chances that randomly someone who has no genetic relation to you whatsoever has exactly the same combination of DNA as you? No chance. Okay, that's why DNA evidence is like rock solid in court. Okay, because there is no chance that somebody who has absolutely no relation to you has the same DNA as you. There is a theoretical, mathematically small probability of that, but it's so incredibly unlikely. Okay, and it wouldn't be some random person. It would have to be someone who had some sort of relation to you. It's just with that many different combinations, the idea that, I mean, that would be your true doppelganger, right? If they're genetically identical to you, they're your doppelganger. They look just like you and they have no relation to you whatsoever. You guys know what I mean, doppelganger? You guys heard that term? Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, so some organisms, this is the paramecium example, okay, that will use both methods. So they'll have an exchange of DNA, okay, this conjugation where they exchange the DNA, and then they'll reproduce by binary fission, mitosis, okay, and produce genetically different offspring. Okay, and then some fungi and algae. So animals are like this, right? You get gametes from both parents, and you get a zygote, and then you get a diploid. That means two copies of everything organism. Okay. With fungi and algae, okay, you get gametes, you get fertilization, okay, and there's haploid organisms that only have one copy. In fungus, it's kind of weird. Okay. Plants and algae, same idea. You get a gametophyte. The flower is actually the sexually reproducing part of a plant, okay? And there's a female part of it and a male part of it, and that's called the gametophyte. It's actually haploid, which means it only has one copy of all the DNA, and that's what makes the pollen. The pollen contains plant sperm, and the style, okay, and stigma, the thing that comes out of the middle of the flower, okay, that's the female part, and when the pollen lands on that, the pollen reacts with it, and the sperm will swim down the tube and fertilize the egg that's at the base of the flower, because that's where the fruit comes from. Okay, when that gets fertilized, it makes a seed. The flower engorges around it with sugar, surrounds the seed with fruit. Okay, that's how plants reproduce. We'll talk about that later in the plant thing. Okay, give you an idea there. Okay, now, can some organisms reproduce sexually and fertilize themselves? Flowers do that. Plants do it all the time. Okay. If you look at the structure of a flower, it's actually almost designed to do that. Okay. So there's this stigma. Okay. So the top of this part of the flower. It's a terrible drawing. Okay. And then there's these things here that come off to the side, and they kind of are shaped like this. If you look at the inside of a flower. Okay. And then the petals would be down here. I'm a terrible artist. You guys see that? Okay. This is really starting to look awful. Anyway, okay, all the pollen is up here. Okay, so when these things, as they grow taller and taller, there's the possibility that their own pollen could fall onto the stigma, and then they would fertilize themselves. Okay, so self-pollination happens in plants fairly often. Usually, though, they try to avoid that by having the anthers, that's the male part, these parts, grow later. Okay, so there'll be a possibility that pollen could be blown in from another source, or that a bug that comes in to eat the nectar would transfer it. That's the importance of bees and bugs and things like that, is to bring pollen from other organisms over to fertilize it. Okay? Yeah? Okay. All right, and that's all we need from that one. Oh, I might get through three.